The invitation was a masterpiece of minimalism, announcing a celebration in a loft that looked more like a gallery than a home. It sat on the marble island, mocking the silence, while outside the snow buried the city in white. We often ignore the cracks in the foundation until the roof comes down, blinding ourselves with the paint and the polish. If you have ever stood in a room full of people and felt entirely, devastatingly alone, I invite you to stay with me as we peel back the layers of this marriage. The freight elevator groaned as it ascended, a mechanical complaint that echoed the ache in Andrew's lower back. 10 days. 3,000 miles. The haul from Chicago to New York had been brutal, fighting black ice on I-80 and a radiator that kept overheating in Pennsylvania. He smelled like diesel, stale coffee, and the specific, metallic cold of a truck stop at 3 a.m. When the heavy iron doors slid open, Andrew stepped directly into the loft, and the transition was jarring enough to make him dizzy. The apartment, a converted factory floor in Dumbo, was breathtaking. 20-foot ceilings, exposed brick painted a gallery white, and floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the Brooklyn Bridge and the Manhattan skyline like a postcard. It was silent, smelling of expensive sandalwood and fresh lilies. It was a space designed to be looked at, not lived in. Andrew dropped his heavy duffel bag on the floor. The thud was the only unpolished sound in the room. Shoes. A voice called out from the living area. Rachel didn't look up. She was standing on a step ladder by the massive bookshelf, adjusting the position of a ceramic vase. She moved it an inch to the left, stepped back, tilted her head, and then moved it a millimeter to the right. She wore a silk blouse and black trousers, her blonde hair pulled back in a severe, chic bun. "Hey to you too," Andrew said, his voice raspy. He kicked off his heavy work boots, lining them up on the rubber mat by the door, conscious of the grease on the soles. He walked into the living room, his socks sliding on the polished concrete floors. He wanted to hug her. He wanted to bury his face in her neck and forget the endless gray highway. But the air around her was like a force field of tension. "You're back early," Rachel said, finally glancing at him. Her eyes scanned him, not with longing, but with a critical assessment of his grime. "Don't sit on the white sofa, Andy. You look industrial." "I drove straight through from Ohio," Andrew said, stopping by the kitchen island. "Wanted to be here to help you set up for the party." "The party," Rachel repeated, her focus snapping back to the vase. "It has to be perfect. The curator from the Whitney is coming. And the buyers from Soho. This isn't just a housewarming, Andrew. It's a debut." Andrew sighed, rubbing his face with his hands. He walked to the kitchen sink to get a glass of water. The faucet was gold-plated, a ridiculous expense they couldn't afford, but Rachel had insisted. Every inch of this place was leveraged on his overtime. On the marble island, her iPad was propped up, displaying a spreadsheet. "The guest list. I thought we agreed on close friends and a few colleagues," Andrew said, drinking the water. "How many are coming?" 60, Rachel said. "It's networking, Andrew. You know how the art world works. If you're not seen, you don't exist." Andrew swiped a finger across the iPad screen. He scrolled past names he didn't know. Critics, gallery owners, socialites. People who would drink his wine and ask him what he did for a living, only to look away when he said transportation. Then, his finger stopped. Row 52. Sebastian Vane. Andrew froze. The water in his stomach turned to ice. He stared at the name, hoping it was a different Sebastian. But how many Sebastians did they know in the New York art scene? "Rachel," Andrew said. The tone of his voice made her stop adjusting the vase. "What? Why is Sebastian coming here?" Rachel descended the ladder slowly. She smoothed her blouse, her face composing itself into a mask of cool detachment. "He's in town for his retrospective at the MoMA. He's looking for new representation for his private collection. My gallery wants him." "I don't care what your gallery wants," Andrew said, his grip tightening on the glass. "He's the guy who told you you weren't talented enough to paint. He's the guy who cheated on you with his assistant and left you having panic attacks on the bathroom floor. You want him in our home." "That was 5 years ago," Rachel said, walking over to the island. She didn't look ashamed. She looked annoyed. "I'm a professional, Andrew. And he is a whale. If I land Sebastian Vane, I make director by next year. He's not setting foot in this loft, Andrew said, his voice low and steady. I paid for this floor. I paid for that view. I'm not hosting the man who broke you. You didn't break me, Rachel snapped, her eyes flashing. You were there when I was broken. There's a difference. The words hit Andrew like a physical blow. He set the glass down, terrified he might crush it. I picked up the pieces, Rachel. I worked double shifts to get you out of debt. I drove through blizzards so you could have this museum. And you want to parade him around in front of me? It's not about you. Rachel shouted, her composure cracking. God, why do you always make it about your sacrifice? This is my career. This is my chance to prove I'm not just some failed artist. I need him here. I'm not doing it, Andrew said. Uninvite him. Or tell him the party is canceled. I don't care. But he isn't coming through that door. The room went silent. The wind howled outside, rattling the massive pane of glass that separated them from the freezing drop to the East River. Rachel looked at Andrew. She looked at his grease-stained t-shirt, his tired eyes, the gray hairs appearing in his beard. Then she looked around the loft, the white walls, the high ceilings, the life she had constructed. She made her choice. She picked up the iPad and clutched it to her chest like a shield. He has already RSVP'd, she said, her voice dropping to a chillingly calm register. He is the guest of honor, Andrew. He is my future. And what am I? Andrew asked. Rachel didn't answer the question directly. She straightened her spine, looking every bit the ruthless director she had become. My ex will be at the housewarming, she said, the words cutting through the expensive air. Deal with it, or get out. She turned her back on him and walked toward the master bedroom, leaving Andrew standing in the kitchen, the smell of diesel still clinging to his skin, realizing that the cold outside was nothing compared to the temperature inside his own home. The door to the master bedroom clicked shut, the lock sliding into place with a sound that felt final. Andrew stood in the hallway for a long moment, staring at the white lacquer finish of the door. He was still wearing his boots, despite her instructions. He could feel the vibration of the road still humming in his legs, a phantom sensation from 10 days of driving. But the exhaustion was suddenly gone, replaced by a cold, sharp adrenaline. He didn't knock. He didn't shout. He turned and walked down the hallway to the guest room, the only room in the loft that Rachel rarely entered. He pushed the door open. The air inside was stale and cooler than the rest of the apartment. While the living room was a showroom of minimalist luxury, this room was a graveyard of Andrew's identity. Cardboard boxes were stacked in the corner, labeled Andrew's books and tools. His old acoustic guitar sat in its case, gathering dust. The bed was unmade, a bare mattress with a single gray blanket thrown over it. This was the storage room, the place for things that didn't fit the aesthetic. Apparently, that now included him. Andrew dropped his duffel bag onto the mattress. He sat down and unlaced his boots, his hands shaking slightly. He looked at his knuckles, scarred and stained with grease. These hands had fixed the transmission of a Peterbilt on the side of a highway in Nebraska, so he could make the delivery bonus. These hands had signed the checks for the custom Italian sofa Rachel was currently fluffing pillows on in the other room. He stood up and stripped off his clothes, walking into the small, attached bathroom. It didn't have the gold fixtures or the rain shower of the master bath. It was functional, plain. He turned the water on as hot as it would go. Under the spray, he tried to scrub the diesel smell from his skin, but the scent of the argument seemed to cling to him. Deal with it, or get out. The words replayed in his mind on a loop. Any self-respecting man would have packed his bag and walked out right then. He knew that. He knew he was being a coward by staying. But he couldn't leave. Not yet. It was a morbid curiosity, like slowing down to look at a car wreck. He needed to see it. He needed to see Rachel with Sebastian. He needed to know if the last 3 years of their marriage, the years he spent rebuilding her confidence while she rebuilt her career, were real. Or if he was just a placeholder, a sturdy piece of infrastructure she used to bridge the gap between her failure and her comeback. He turned off the water and dried himself with a rough towel. When he walked back into the bedroom, he saw it. Hanging on the back of the closet door, still in its plastic dry cleaning bag, was the tuxedo. Rachel had bought it 2 weeks ago. For the image, she had said. It wasn't just a suit, it was a costume. She didn't want a husband at this party. She wanted a prop. A silent, handsome accessory that wouldn't talk about torque or mileage or the price of diesel. Andrew walked over to the suit and ran his hand over the fabric. It was smooth, expensive, and black. It looked like a morning suit. Outside the door, he heard the heavy drag of furniture against concrete. Rachel was rearranging the living room again. He heard the sharp click-clack of her heels, the murmur of her voice on the phone. Yes, the lighting needs to be lower, she was saying, her voice muffled through the wall. Dramatic. He likes dramatic. Sebastian. Andrew sat on the edge of the bare mattress, the darkness of the room pressing in on him. He felt a profound sense of foolishness. He had built a castle for a queen who was waiting for another king. He reached into his duffel bag and pulled out a bottle of cheap bourbon he kept for the road. He didn't bother with a glass. He took a long pull, the burns settling in his chest, warring with the coldness in his heart. He would stay. He would put on the tuxedo. He would play the part of the dutiful husband one last time. But he wouldn't be doing it for her. He would be doing it to confirm what he already suspected, that the Andrew who walked into this apartment tonight was not the man who would walk out of it. He lay back on the mattress, staring at the unfinished ceiling where the exposed pipes ran like arteries. Above him, the city lights flickered, casting long, cage-like shadows across the room. He closed his eyes, but sleep was impossible. He was a stranger in his own house, waiting for the show to begin. At 7:15 p.m., Andrew stepped out of the guest room and crossed the hallway to the master suite. The door was open now. Inside, the room smelled of burning hairspray and ozone. It was the scent of transformation. Rachel stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirror. She was wearing a backless gown the color of liquid mercury, a dress that shimmered with every breath she took. It was severe, architectural, and breathtaking. She was applying lipstick with the precision of a surgeon, her mouth slightly open, eyes locked on her own reflection. She didn't turn when Andrew entered. She simply watched him in the glass. "You're late," she murmured, blotting her lips. "People will be here in 45 minutes. Andrew didn't reply. He walked to the bed where the tuxedo lay spread out like a dissected shadow. He picked up the shirt. It was starched so stiffly it could have stood up on its own. As he unbuttoned it, his fingers felt clumsy. His hands were swollen from the long haul, the knuckles rough and red. Against the pristine white cotton, they looked like foreign objects. He pulled the shirt on. It was tight across the shoulders. Rachel had bought it a size too small, or perhaps he had just broadened from lifting crates over the last year. He fumbled with the tiny pearl buttons, his patience fraying with every slip. "Here," Rachel said. She was suddenly there, standing in front of him. She batted his hands away efficiently, her fingers cool and dry. She began to button the shirt, working from the bottom up. It was an intimate gesture, the kind that usually signaled affection, but there was no warmth in it. She was dressing a mannequin. She was preparing a set piece. "Did you scrub your nails?" she asked, not looking at his face, but staring intently at his collar. "With a wire brush," Andrew said, his voice flat. "Is that good enough for the MoMA crowd?" Rachel paused, her eyes flicking up to his for a second. There was a flicker of annoyance, quickly suppressed. "Don't start, Andrew. Not tonight. I just need you to be polished." She finished the buttons and reached for the black silk bow tie. She spun him around to face the mirror, standing behind him to tie it. In the reflection, they looked like a power couple on the cover of a magazine. But Andrew looked closely at his own eyes. They were tired, rimmed with red, deadened. "Listen to me," she said, her voice low, close to his ear as she tightened the knot. "When Sebastian gets here, just be polite. You don't need to engage him in conversation about art. Just offer him a drink and move on." "Move on to where?" Andrew asked, watching her hands at his throat. "The kitchen? The balcony? Where do you want me to hide?" "I want you to circulate," she corrected, giving the tie a final, sharp tug that made him wince. "Talk to the investors. But keep it light. If they ask about work, say you're in logistics. Don't go into the details about the truck, okay? We don't need to talk about way stations and rest stops." "Logistics," Andrew repeated, testing the word. It tasted like ash. So I should lie. It's not lying. It's framing, Rachel said. She stepped back and surveyed him. She picked a piece of invisible lint off his lapel. There. You look appropriate. Appropriate. Not handsome. Not dashing. Appropriate. Like a vase that matched the curtains. She turned back to her jewelry box, selecting a pair of diamond earrings that Andrew knew he hadn't paid for. They must have been a loan from the gallery, or perhaps a gift she hadn't told him about. Why are you really doing this, Rachel? Andrew asked quietly. He was standing stiffly in the suit, feeling the collar bite into his neck. Doing what? She clipped an earring on. Parading him in front of me. Is it just business? Or do you need to show him that you won? That you married a guy who could buy you this loft? Rachel froze. She lowered her hands, her back to him. The silence stretched, filled only by the hum of the city outside and the distant wail of a siren. You think this is about you winning? She whispered, turning around slowly. Her face was hard, beautiful, and terrifying. Andrew, this isn't about you at all. It's about survival. You drive a truck. You look at the road. I look at the world. And in my world, Sebastian Vane is a king. If I want to sit at the table, I have to invite him to dinner. Even if I hate him. Do you? Andrew asked. Hate him? Rachel didn't answer. She walked past him, grabbing a bottle of perfume from the dresser. She sprayed a cloud of it into the air and walked through it, armoring herself in scent. Finish getting dressed, she said, opening the bedroom door. And put on the cufflinks. The silver ones. Not the ones your mother gave you. She walked out, the train of her mercury dress flowing behind her like liquid metal. Andrew stood alone in the center of the room, the scent of her perfume choking him. He looked at the silver cufflinks on the dresser, sleek, modern, cold. Beside them were the old brass ones his father had left him, the ones he actually liked. He picked up the silver ones. He shoved them through the holes of his cuffs with a jagged force that nearly tore the fabric. He was ready. He was the logistics manager. He was the husband in the tuxedo. He walked to the mirror one last time and saw a stranger staring back, a man dressed for his own execution. The buzzer signaled the beginning of the invasion at exactly 8 p.m. It started as a trickle. First, the gallery assistants, young, terrified-looking women in all black, who spoke in whispers. Then the minor collectors, older couples with skin that looked too tight and eyewear that looked architectural. By 8:45 p.m., the loft was no longer a home. It was a high-frequency zone of chatter, the clinking of crystal, and the screech of jazz from the hidden speakers. Andrew stood near the kitchen island, which had been converted into a bar. He held a bottle of vintage Pinot Noir, pouring it into the outstretched glass of a man who hadn't looked him in the eye once. It's a marvelous space, the man was saying to his companion, a woman wearing a necklace that looked like a bicycle chain made of platinum. The light is aggressive, but in a good way. Very industrial chic. It used to be a textile factory, Andrew offered, placing the bottle down. My grandfather actually worked in a building like this. Back when it was just sweat and noise. The man turned his head slowly, looking at Andrew as if a piece of furniture had suddenly spoken. He blinked, a polite, confused smile plastering onto his face. Is that so? Charming. He turned back to the woman immediately. Anyway, did you see what Sebastian did in Berlin? The installation with the melting wax? Andrew took a step back, his heel catching on the edge of the rubber mat. He was invisible. He was a ghost in a tuxedo. He scanned the room for Rachel. She was by the floor-to-ceiling windows, framed against the backdrop of the Brooklyn Bridge. She looked radiant, ethereal. She held a champagne flute in one hand and was gesturing animatedly with the other, holding court with a group of 4 men who hung on her every word. She threw her head back and laughed, a sound Andrew realized he hadn't heard in months. It wasn't her real laugh. It was her gallery laugh. Higher, sharper, performative. He watched her touch the arm of a tall man in a velvet blazer. It was a casual, professional touch, but it stung Andrew all the same. She was fluid, adapting to the shape of the room, while he felt like a concrete block dropped in the middle of a ballet. Excuse me, a voice chirped at his elbow. Andrew looked down. A young man with bleached hair and a mesh shirt was holding an empty glass. Could I get a top-up? And do you have any lime? I'm not the bartender, Andrew said, his voice gruff. The young man's eyes widened slightly, scanning Andrew's tuxedo. Oh, my apologies. You were just standing there behind the counter. I assumed. I live here, Andrew said. Oh, you're the husband. The young man's face brightened with a toxic kind of delight. Rachel mentions you. You're in shipping? Logistics? Something like that, Andrew said. He felt the lie sitting heavy on his tongue, tasting of diesel. I move things. Fascinating, the boy said, already scanning the room for someone more important. Must be very grounding to deal with physical objects. We're all so conceptual these days. He drifted away before Andrew could respond, leaving him alone with the uncorked wine and the rising tide of resentment. Andrew moved away from the bar, needing to escape the service zone. He navigated the crowd, dodging elbows and avoiding eye contact. The air was getting hot, thick with the scent of 60 different expensive perfumes and the underlying metallic tang of the radiator. He walked past a group discussing the death of painting and another debating the tax implications of offshore storage. He reached the far wall, where a piece of art Rachel had bought last year hung. It was a white canvas with a single, slash-like tear down the middle. It had cost more than his truck. Andrew. He turned. It was Julianne, one of the few friends of Rachel's who had actually treated him with kindness in the past. She was a curator, older, with kind eyes that saw too much. Hello, Julianne, Andrew said, grateful for a familiar face. You look dashing, she said, though her eyes darted to his clenched jaw. But you look like you're guarding a bank vault. Relax. It's a party. It feels like an auction, Andrew muttered. Julianne sipped her drink, lowering her voice. It is an auction, darling. Everyone here is buying or selling something. Reputation. Influence. Sex. It's all commerce. She paused, looking at him significantly. Rachel is very nervous tonight. This Sebastian business. It's a big gamble for her. She seems fine to me, Andrew said, nodding toward his wife, who was now clinking glasses with a critic from the Times. Adrenaline, Julian said. She's terrified. Sebastian is complicated. He eats people, Andrew. He consumes them for his art. Just keep an eye on her. I'm trying, Andrew said. But I don't think she wants to be watched. Not by me. Before Julianne could answer, a hush rippled through the room. It wasn't a silence. It was a frequency shift. The chatter didn't stop, but it lowered, intensified. Heads turned toward the freight elevator doors. The heavy metal slid open with a groan that sounded like a drum roll. Andrew felt the temperature in the room drop. He didn't need to look to know who it was. The air shifted. The king had arrived to inspect his court. Rachel stopped mid-sentence. Her hand froze on the stem of her glass. She turned toward the elevator, her posture straightening, her chest heaving once, sharply. Andrew stood by the slashed canvas, his hands in his pockets, balling into fists. He watched his wife prepare to greet the man who had destroyed her, and he felt a sudden, violent urge to shatter every glass in the room. Sebastian Vane did not step into the room. He occurred to it. He wore a long, charcoal wool coat that looked slept in yet cost more than the down payment on the loft. His hair was a chaotic storm of dark curls, graying at the temples, and his face, gaunt, unshaven, with eyes that looked like they had seen things ordinary people couldn't comprehend, held an expression of perpetual, bored amusement. He didn't apologize for the interruption. He didn't smile. He simply stood there, peeling off leather gloves finger by finger, letting the silence of the room stretch until it became uncomfortable, a tension he manipulated like clay. Rachel moved. Andrew watched her from his exile by the slashed canvas. He saw the shift in her spine, the way her shoulders dropped their defensive squareness and curved into something softer, more pliable. She didn't walk. She drifted, the mercury dress flowing around her legs like water seeking its level. She crossed the 20 feet of polished concrete, separating them, as if drawn by a magnet. Sebastian, she said. Her voice was breathless, stripped of the sharp, professional cadence she had used on Andrew all evening. It was a voice Andrew hadn't heard since their second date. Sebastian finished removing his gloves. He stuffed them into his pockets, and looked at Rachel. He didn't look at her face. He looked at the loft. His eyes scanned the high ceilings, the exposed beams, the meticulously curated art. It was an inspection. "You found a view," Sebastian said. His voice was a baritone rumble, scratchy with smoke. "It's quaint. Very Brooklyn." It was a subtle dig at the borough, at her effort, at the very foundation of the life she had built. Andrew bristled, his hand tightening around his wine glass. He waited for Rachel to defend their home, to tell him about the history of the building or the struggle to get the permits. Instead, Rachel laughed. A nervous, girlish sound. "It is a bit removed from the city," she conceded, practically apologizing for her own address. "But the light is good for the collection. I wanted you to see the light." "The light is unforgiving, darling," Sebastian said. He finally looked at her. He reached out, not to shake her hand, but to brush a stray lock of hair from her forehead. It was a gesture of ownership, intimate and shocking in front of 60 people. "But you look like a Klimt painting. Gold and geometry." Rachel flushed. The color rose in her cheeks, a genuine, painful blush. She leaned into his touch for a fraction of a second before remembering herself. "Come," she said, her hand hovering near his arm but not daring to land. "Everyone is dying to meet you. The curator from the Whitney is here." "I don't care about the Whitney," Sebastian said, loud enough for the nearby guests to hear. He smiled, a wolfish, charming grin. "I came to see what you've done with yourself, Rachel. I came to see if you've started painting again." Rachel froze. The room seemed to hold its breath. Andrew knew the answer. Rachel hadn't painted in 5 years. Not since Sebastian told her she was derivative. Not since the night she burned her sketchbooks in a trash can in the alley behind her old apartment. I'm curating now," she whispered. "I help others find their vision." "A pity," Sebastian murmured. He began to walk into the room, the crowd parting for him like the Red Sea. He moved with a languid entitlement, taking a glass of champagne from a passing tray without looking at the server. Rachel followed him, trailing a step behind, her eyes fixed on his back. She had forgotten the party. She had forgotten the investors. And, most devastatingly, she had forgotten Andrew. Andrew stood rooted to the spot. He felt a hand on his arm and jumped. It was Julianne, looking at him with pity. "Don't," she whispered. "Don't go over there right now." "She's following him like a puppy," Andrew said, his voice grinding out of his throat. "He insulted the house, and she thanked him." "He's playing a game," Julianne said. "He thrives on this. If you go over there and puff your chest out, you lose. You become the jealous husband. The obstacle. That's the narrative he wants." Andrew looked at the crowd swarming around Sebastian and Rachel. He saw the way the men laughed too hard at Sebastian's jokes, the way the women leaned in. And he saw Rachel, glowing, alive, electrified by the very toxicity that had almost killed her. He felt a sudden, crushing weight of realization. This wasn't just an ex-boyfriend. This was a religion Rachel had lost faith in, and now the prophet had returned. Andrew wasn't the husband. He was the heretic. He turned away from the spectacle, his stomach churning. He couldn't watch them. He needed air. He walked toward the kitchen, intent on finding something stronger than wine, but the path was blocked. The party had rotated. The center of gravity had shifted to wherever Sebastian stood. Andrew was forced to skirt the edges of his own home, walking along the walls, a perimeter guard patrolling a fortress that had already been breached. The circle around Sebastian Vane had migrated. Like a predatory school of fish, the guests followed him toward the center of the loft, where the floating staircase connected the main floor to the mezzanine bedroom. It was Andrew's masterpiece. He had spent 3 months on those stairs. He had sourced the reclaimed white oak from a demolished barn in upstate New York, driving the truck up there himself on a Sunday to haul the timber back. He had planed the wood, welded the hidden steel supports, and calculated the load-bearing tension until his eyes blurred. He wanted them to look like they were hovering, defying gravity. Now, Sebastian was leaning against the railing, a glass of scotch in his hand, using the structure Andrew had sweated over as a prop for his monologue. Andrew found himself drifting closer, drawn by a masochistic need to hear what was being said. He stood outside the circle, holding a lukewarm beer he'd retrieved from the back of the fridge, looking like a bodyguard who had wandered into a gala. "The space has potential," Sebastian was saying, running a hand along the smooth grain of the banister. "But the transitions are abrupt. Take these stairs, for instance." He tapped the oak with his signet ring. Click, click. "They are aggressive," Sebastian declared. "They shout, 'Look at me.' Good design should whisper, don't you think? This feels heavy. It lacks the ethereal quality the windows demand. It feels like a cage." A ripple of murmuring agreement went through the group. "Yes, a bit brutalist," someone whispered. "Too masculine." Andrew felt the heat climb up his neck, hotter than the radiator steam. He stepped forward, breaking the perimeter. "It's not a cage," Andrew said. His voice was deeper, rougher than the polished tenors around him. The circle parted, surprised by the interruption. Sebastian stopped mid-sip and turned his hooded eyes toward Andrew. He looked amused, as if a golden retriever had just tried to explain calculus. "Ah," Sebastian said. "The husband. The logistics man." "I built them," Andrew said, ignoring the title. He looked at Rachel, who was standing at Sebastian's elbow, her face suddenly pale. "I built this staircase. The steel is embedded in the brick. It can hold 2 tons. It's meant to last." Sebastian smiled, a slow, pitying expression. "Solidity," he mused. "How quaint. You see, in art, we value the ephemeral, the suggestion of support, rather than the brute force of it. But I suppose for a man in transport, durability is the highest virtue." The crowd chuckled. It was a soft, sophisticated sound, like dry leaves rustling. Andrew didn't look at the crowd. He looked at his wife. He needed her to say it. He needed her to say, "Andrew worked nights for months on this. He built this home for us." He needed her to validate the sweat, the splinters, the fatigue. "Rachel," Andrew said quietly. Rachel looked at Andrew. Then she looked at Sebastian. She saw the boredom in Sebastian's eyes, the way he was already losing interest in the heavy stairs. She panicked. She couldn't let the mood drop. She couldn't let Andrew's earnestness ruin the aesthetic. She took a sip of her champagne and let out a light, breathless laugh. "Oh, don't mind him," Rachel said, waving a hand dismissively at Andrew. "Andrew is very literal. He loves his heavy wood and his steel. I keep telling him we should replace it with glass, something that breathes, but he's so attached to his projects." She turned her back on Andrew, facing Sebastian with a bright, apologetic smile. "You're right, of course, Sebastian. It is a bit clunky. Maybe when you sign with the gallery, you can help me redesign the flow. I've always hated how distinct it feels." The words hit Andrew like a tire iron to the chest. "I've always hated it." She had cried when he finished it. She had sat on the 3rd step, drinking wine, telling him he was a genius. She had told him it was the heart of the house. And now, for the sake of a nod from a narcissist in a wool coat, she had reduced his labor of love to a clunky project she tolerated. Sebastian chuckled, draped an arm around Rachel's shoulders, and squeezed. "We'll see, darling. We'll see. There's a lot we would need to strip away to find the soul of this place." "Yes," Rachel agreed, leaning into him. "Strip it away." The conversation moved on. They started talking about light fixtures. The circle closed up again, sealing the gap Andrew had made. Andrew stood there for a moment, staring at the back of his wife's head, the beautiful blonde bun, the diamond earrings he hadn't bought. He looked at the stairs. They were strong. They were honest. They were built to carry weight. But as he looked at Rachel, he realized the weight they were carrying was no longer shared. He set his beer down on the railing, the beautiful, hand-sanded railing, leaving a wet condensation ring on the wood. He didn't wipe it up. He turned around and walked away from the center of the room. He didn't go to the kitchen. He didn't go to the bar. He walked toward the dark corner under the mezzanine, where the shadows were deep enough to hide a man who had just ceased to exist. Andrew climbed the floating staircase slowly. His hand trailed along the white oak banister, feeling the vibration of the bass from the speakers thrumming through the wood. He ascended past the heads of the guests, past the cloud of perfume and pretension, until he reached the mezzanine level. This was the bedroom floor, an open-concept balcony that offered a panoramic view of the party below. From up here, the guests looked like swarming insects in designer clothes, moving in erratic patterns of social climbing and desperate validation. He retreated into the shadows of the hallway, leaning against the cold brick wall. He was hidden here. The lighting was dimmed for the party, and from the bright floor below, the mezzanine was nothing but a void. He was the invisible man in his own castle. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked for the gold dress. It didn't take long to find her. Rachel and Sebastian had migrated toward the far corner of the loft, near the massive windows that overlooked the East River. They had created a private island in the sea of people. The guests, sensing the exclusionary energy radiating from them, gave them a wide berth. Andrew watched. It was like watching a silent film he knew the ending to. Rachel was leaning against the glass, the city lights haloing her silhouette. Her body language was entirely open, unguarded in a way Andrew hadn't seen in years. With him, she was always composed, always managing the situation. With Sebastian, she was unraveling. Sebastian stood close to her, too close for a casual conversation, too close for a professional negotiation. He had one hand in his pocket, the other holding a tumbler of dark liquor. He was speaking low, his head inclined toward hers. Andrew couldn't hear the words, but he could read the syntax of their bodies. Sebastian said something, and Rachel threw her head back, laughing. It wasn't the polite gallery laugh she had used earlier. It was a raw, throaty sound that Andrew could almost feel in his chest. Then, Sebastian did something that made Andrew's breath hitch. He reached out and took the empty champagne flute from Rachel's hand. He set it on the windowsill without looking away from her eyes. Then, he took her hand, the hand wearing Andrew's wedding ring, and inspected it. He turned it over, tracing the line of her palm with his thumb. Rachel didn't pull away. She stared at him, her expression a mixture of hunger and terrifying vulnerability. Andrew closed his eyes. The image burned behind his eyelids. He realized then that he had never really cured her depression. He had simply been the rehab facility. He was the safe harbor where she repaired her sails while waiting for the storm to return. And now the storm was here, chaotic and destructive and thrilling, and she was ready to push off from the dock. He opened his eyes and looked down again. Sebastian released her hand, but didn't step back. He leaned in and whispered something in her ear. Rachel listened, her eyes closing briefly, her chest rising and falling rapidly. She looked. Hi. She looked addicted. Andrew felt a strange sensation. It wasn't anger anymore. The anger had burned itself out, leaving behind a hollow, cold clarity. He was looking at a stranger. The woman who had sat on the floor with him eating takeout pizza. The woman who had cried in his arms when her mother died. The woman who had promised to build a life with him. She wasn't down there. The woman down there belonged to the art world. She belonged to the noise and the lights and the cruelty. She belonged to Sebastian. Andrew looked at his own reflection in the darkened glass of the bedroom window. He saw the tuxedo that didn't fit. He saw the tired trucker with the grease under his nails that no amount of scrubbing could hide. He saw a man who had driven 3,000 miles to come home, only to find that home had been relocated without him. He pushed himself off the wall. He didn't want to drink. He didn't want to make a scene. He didn't want to punch Sebastian. That would be melodramatic, and tonight was all about subtlety, wasn't it? He turned toward the master bedroom. He needed to get his bag. The show was over, and the crew needed to clear out. Andrew retreated into the guest room, closing the door softly behind him. The sound of the latch clicking into place severed the connection to the party, muffling the jazz and the laughter into a dull, rhythmic thrum. The room was dark, illuminated only by the amber glow of the streetlights filtering through the blinds. Andrew didn't turn on the overhead light. He didn't need to see the boxes or the dust to know where he was. He walked to the bed and sat down heavily on the edge of the mattress, the duffel bag sitting beside him like a loyal dog waiting for a command. He looked down at his hands, resting on the knees of his tuxedo trousers. The silver cufflinks, the ones Rachel had insisted on, glinted in the half-light. They felt heavy, like shackles. With a sudden, sharp movement, Andrew ripped them out. He threw them onto the bare mattress. Then he undid the bow tie, pulling the silk loose until it hung around his neck like a dead snake. He stood up and began to strip. Off went the jacket that was too tight in the shoulders. Off went the shirt that smelled of starch and other people's perfume. Off went the trousers that were hemmed for a man he wasn't. He kicked the patent leather shoes into the corner. He stood there in the dark, shivering slightly, not from cold, but from the adrenaline of release. He reached into his duffel bag and pulled out his clothes. A pair of worn Levi's, softened by years of grease and washing. A thermal Henley shirt. A heavy flannel overshirt. And finally, his work boots. As he laced up the boots, pulling the strings tight, he felt a grounding sensation return. The numbness that had plagued him all evening began to recede, replaced by the familiar, aching solidity of his own body. He wasn't the logistics manager anymore. He was Andrew. Ding, ding, ding. The sound of a spoon tapping against crystal cut through the floorboards. The noise downstairs died down, replaced by an expectant hush. If I could have everyone's attention for a moment. Rachel's voice floated up through the ventilation, amplified by the acoustics of the loft. Andrew froze. He stood up, grabbed his duffel bag, and walked to the door. He opened it a crack, just enough to hear. "I want to thank you all for coming tonight," Rachel said. Her voice was trembling with emotion, performative, beautiful emotion. "This space, this home, has been a dream of mine for a decade. It's been a long, hard road to get here." There was a murmur of appreciation from the crowd. "They say that architecture is frozen music," she continued, quoting something she had likely read in a magazine that morning. "But for me, this loft is a canvas. It's a place where art and life can finally bleed into each other." Andrew stepped out into the hallway, moving silently toward the railing of the mezzanine. He looked down. Rachel stood in the center of the room, radiant in her mercury dress. She raised her glass. But she wasn't looking at the crowd. And she certainly wasn't looking up at the mezzanine where her husband stood. She was looking directly at Sebastian Vane, who was leaning against a pillar, watching her with a possessive smirk. "To vision," Rachel said, her voice dropping to a whisper that carried to every corner of the room. "And to the people who inspire us to never settle for mediocrity. To the future." "To the future," the crowd echoed. Sebastian raised his glass to her, a silent toast between two conspirators. Andrew felt a physical pain in his chest, sharp and clean. She hadn't mentioned him. She hadn't mentioned the overtime, the mortgage, the sanding, the plumbing, the nights he slept in the cab of his truck to save money for the Italian tile she wanted. In her narrative, the loft had materialized out of her sheer willpower and taste. He had been edited out of the script completely. He looked at his left hand. The gold band on his ring finger felt suddenly alien. It was a lie. It was a symbol of a partnership that didn't exist. Slowly, deliberately, Andrew twisted the ring. It was tight over his knuckle, resistant, as if the metal itself was trying to hold on. But he pulled, harder, until it slid off. He held the ring for a second, feeling its weight. He thought about leaving it on the railing. He thought about throwing it down into the crowd. But that would be dramatic. That would be aggressive, as Sebastian would say. Instead, he shoved the ring into the pocket of his jeans. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction of a scene. He wouldn't become an anecdote they told at brunch tomorrow, the crazy husband who threw a fit. He shouldered his duffel bag. The strap dug into his flannel shirt, a familiar, comforting pressure. Downstairs, the applause was swelling. The jazz music started up again, louder this time. The guests began to mingle, turning their backs to the stairs, their faces turned toward the light, toward Rachel, toward the king and queen of the evening. Andrew took the first step down. The heavy, floating staircase didn't creak. It held his weight silently, strong and indifferent, just as he had built it to be. He began his descent, walking down into the party not as a guest, but as a ghost passing through the walls one last time. Andrew reached the bottom of the stairs. His heavy work boots landed on the polished concrete with a dull thud, but the sound was swallowed by the swell of laughter and the clinking of glass. He was now standing on the periphery of the party, a large, dark shape in flannel and denim amidst a sea of shimmering silk and black wool. He adjusted the strap of his duffel bag on his shoulder. He felt like a traveler who had stumbled into the wrong terminal. He began to move toward the front door. It was a straight line, perhaps 30 feet, but it felt like crossing a minefield. He had to weave between clusters of guests. A woman in a red velvet jumpsuit stepped back, nearly bumping into him. She turned, ready to apologize, but when her eyes landed on his grease-stained jeans and the heavy flannel shirt, her expression shifted from polite to confused. She didn't recognize him as the man in the tuxedo from 20 minutes ago. She saw a workman, a contractor, someone who had come to fix a leak or take out the trash. She pulled her drink close to her chest and stepped aside, giving him a wide berth. "Excuse me," Andrew muttered, his voice rough. He kept his head down, focused on the heavy steel door at the end of the hall. He passed the bar. The young man with the bleached hair, the one who had asked about logistics, was there, leaning against the counter. He looked up as Andrew passed. His eyes widened in recognition, flickering from Andrew's face to the duffel bag. For a second, the boy looked like he might say something. "Where are you going? Aren't you the husband?" But Andrew's face was set in stone, a mask of such grim determination that the boy simply closed his mouth and looked away, pretending he hadn't seen anything. Andrew reached the foyer. This was the entry point he had designed. He had installed the custom coat rack. He had hung the oversized mirror that now reflected a man who didn't belong here. On the console table, a slab of raw walnut, sat a ceramic bowl for keys and mail. Andrew stopped. He could hear Rachel's voice behind him. She was laughing again, that breathless, high-pitched sound that grated against his nerves. "Oh, Sebastian, stop it," she cried out, delighted. Andrew didn't turn around. He didn't want to see them. If he looked back, he might scream, and he refused to give them that satisfaction. He refused to be the disruption in their perfect evening. He would be the silence that followed it. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his keyring. It was heavy, cluttered with keys for the truck, the padlock on the storage unit, his parents' house in Ohio. And there, shining and distinct, was the key to the loft. It was a high-security key, expensive and difficult to duplicate. He worked it off the ring. His fingernail caught, tearing slightly, but he didn't feel the pain. He held the key between his thumb and forefinger. It was just a piece of brass. It was just metal, but it felt like he was holding the last 3 years of his life. The overtime, the missed birthdays, the lonely nights in motel rooms, the hope. He opened his hand. The key dropped into the ceramic bowl. Clink. It was a small sound, sharp and final. It sounded like a period at the end of a sentence. Andrew didn't wait. He gripped the handle of the heavy industrial door, the door he had oiled just last week so it wouldn't squeak, and pulled it open. The rush of cold air hit him instantly. It smelled of snow, exhaust, and the East River. It smelled of reality. He stepped out into the hallway. The door began to close automatically behind him on its hydraulic arm. Just before it shut, sealing the light and the warmth inside, a burst of applause erupted from the party. Rachel must have finished another toast. Or maybe Sebastian had kissed her. It didn't matter. The door clicked shut. The lock engaged. Andrew stood in the dim, quiet hallway of the converted warehouse. The silence was ringing in his ears. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the frigid air. It hurt, but it was a good hurt. It was the feeling of waking up. He walked toward the freight elevator, his boots echoing on the metal floor, leaving the loft, the party, and the wife who had already left him long before he walked out the door. The freight elevator descended with a rhythmic, mechanical shudder, a stark contrast to the smooth, silent descent of the social ladder Andrew had just abandoned. He watched the floor numbers light up in dirty yellow neon above the gate. 3. Lobby. When the gate rattled open, the lobby was empty. The doorman, a guy named Hector whom Andrew usually chatted with about the Knicks, was nowhere to be seen, likely busy hailing cabs for the early departures of the A-list guests. Andrew was grateful for the solitude. He didn't have the energy for goodbyes or explanations. He pushed through the heavy glass front doors and stepped out into the night. The cold was absolute. A nor'easter had picked up while he was inside, turning the Brooklyn streets into a wind tunnel. Snow was falling in thick, wet sheets, coating the cobblestones of Dumbo in a treacherous layer of slush. The wind cut through his flannel shirt, biting at his skin, but Andrew welcomed it. It felt clean. It felt like a purgative, stripping away the scent of expensive perfume and the suffocating heat of the party. He pulled the collar of his jacket up and lowered his head, walking against the wind. His truck was parked 3 blocks away, wedged into a loading zone under the Manhattan Bridge overpass. It was a massive Peterbilt, dark blue and chrome, resting like a sleeping beast in the shadows of the concrete pillars. Rachel hated the truck. She called it a monstrosity and forbade him from parking it within sight of the loft's windows. She said it ruined the aesthetic of the neighborhood. Tonight, however, it looked like the most beautiful thing Andrew had ever seen. He reached the cab, his boots crunching on the frozen grit. He dropped his duffel bag onto the wet pavement and reached up to unlock the door. The handle was freezing, the metal stinging his palm. He swung the heavy door open and climbed up, the familiar strain in his thigh muscles acting as a reminder of who he really was. He tossed the bag onto the passenger seat and pulled himself into the driver's side. The cabin smelled of stale coffee, diesel, and faint tobacco. It was a smell that used to make him feel guilty when he came home to Rachel's lavender-scented world. Now it filled his lungs like oxygen. This was his space. There were no white sofas here. No fragile vases. No people judging him for his grammar or his job title. He sat there for a moment in the dark, his hands gripping the steering wheel. The leather was worn smooth by years of driving, mapped by the friction of his palms. Andrew leaned forward and inserted his key into the ignition. He didn't turn it yet. He looked out the driver's side window, craning his neck to look up. Through the swirling snow and the lattice of the bridge supports, he could just make out the glowing rectangle of their loft window on the 4th floor. It looked like a stage. He could see the silhouettes of people moving inside, small, jerky black shapes against the golden light. They were still drinking, still laughing, still celebrating the vision. Rachel was up there somewhere, probably still standing by the window with Sebastian, basking in the glow of her victory. She didn't know yet. She didn't know that the key was in the bowl. She didn't know that the safety net she had relied on for 3 years was gone. For a second, a wave of profound sadness washed over him. He wasn't mourning the woman up there. He was mourning the version of her that had existed before the loft, before the ambition ate her alive. He was mourning the ghost of the girl who used to ride in this passenger seat, feet up on the dashboard, singing along to the radio while they drove through Kansas. That girl was gone, and the man who loved her had to leave too. Andrew turned the key. The engine roared to life with a deep, guttural thrum that vibrated through the chassis and up into Andrew's bones. It was a sound of power, a sound of forward motion. The air pressure gauges flickered to life. The dashboard lit up in a comforting array of green and amber dials. He released the parking brake. The hiss of the air brakes releasing sounded like a long, heavy sigh. He put the truck into gear. He didn't look up at the window again. He checked his mirrors, habit, muscle memory, professional instinct. The road behind him was empty. The road ahead was white and undefined. He eased the clutch out. The massive tires crunched over the snow, and the truck began to move, rolling slowly out from under the bridge, merging into the dark artery of the city streets, carrying Andrew away from the light and into the storm. By 1:30 a.m., the loft was quiet. The silence didn't fall gently. It crashed down the moment the heavy freight elevator doors slid shut on the last group of stragglers. The space, which hours ago had been a vibrating organism of jazz and laughter, now looked like a shipwreck. Empty champagne flutes littered the marble island like translucent debris. A red wine stain bloomed on the white rug, a casualty of a careless gesture by the curator from the Whitney. The air was thick and stale, smelling of over-oxygenated wine and the lingering, cloying scent of Sebastian's cologne. Rachel stood in the center of the living room, barefoot. She had kicked off her heels 10 minutes ago, her feet aching in a way that felt like a punishment. She held a business card in her hand. Sebastian Vane. Studio. He had left 20 minutes ago. He hadn't kissed her. He hadn't stayed to help clean up. He had simply touched her cheek with a cold finger, smiled that wolfish smile, and said, "Call my assistant on Monday. We'll talk about the collection." It was a victory. It was exactly what she had wanted. She had secured the king. She had impressed the investors. She was the queen of the Brooklyn art scene, at least for tonight. So why did she feel like she was standing in a graveyard? Andrew, she called out. Her voice echoed off the high ceilings and the exposed brick, bouncing back to her thin and reedy. She frowned. She assumed he was sulking in the guest room. He had disappeared hours ago, likely to nurse his wounded pride. She was ready to be magnanimous now. She would tell him it went well. She would maybe even apologize for the comment about the stairs, just a little apology, enough to smooth things over so he would help her load the dishwasher. Andrew, come on. They're gone, she said, walking toward the hallway. You can come out now. She pushed open the door to the guest room. It was dark. She flipped the switch. The light flooded the small space, revealing nothing. The bed was bare. The duffel bag that usually sat in the corner was gone. The closet door was open, swinging slightly on its hinge. Rachel stepped inside, her heart giving a strange, syncopated thump. She looked at the mattress. Lying in the center, glinting under the harsh bulb, were the silver cufflinks she had forced him to wear. They looked abandoned, discarded like shrapnel pulled from a wound. Andrew, she whispered, the annoyance replaced by a sudden, cold spike of fear. She turned and ran back into the hallway. She checked the master bedroom. Empty. She checked the bathroom. Dry. She moved to the kitchen. His keys weren't on the hook where he always hung them. She ran to the foyer. The heavy steel front door was locked. She looked at the walnut console table. The ceramic bowl sat there, usually empty except for loose change. Now, it held a single, brass object. Rachel picked up the key. It was cold against her skin. It was his key. The one he kept on his ring next to the truck ignition key. He never took it off. He used to joke that it was the key to his sanity. She stared at it, her mind struggling to process the data. He left his key. He took his bag. She dropped the key back into the bowl. The clink was deafening in the silence. She turned and sprinted across the polished concrete floor, her bare feet slapping against the cold surface. She ran to the massive floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the street. She pressed her palms against the glass, ignoring the smear she was leaving on the pristine surface. The snow was falling harder now, a white curtain erasing the world. She looked down at the street, 3 stories below. The loading zone under the bridge was empty. There were fresh tracks in the snow, 2 wide, deep ruts left by massive dual tires, cutting a path away from the building, turning onto the on-ramp for the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway. The snow was already filling them in, erasing the evidence that he had ever been there. The truck was gone. The monstrosity she had hated was gone. Rachel stepped back from the window, her breath fogging the glass in a small, shrinking circle. She looked around her dream loft. The floating stairs. The white walls. The expensive art. It was perfect. It was exactly what she had designed. It was a gallery. And like all galleries at night, it was cold, empty, and devoid of life. She wrapped her arms around herself, shivering in the mercury dress that offered no warmth. She realized then that Andrew hadn't just been the logistics man. He hadn't just been the paycheck. He had been the insulation. He was the one thing that had kept the cold out. Andrew, she whispered to the empty room. But there was no answer. Only the wind howling against the glass, and the silence of a house that was no longer a home.